What's up everybody, Todd here. Today we're going to install the ReadyLIFT Big Lift 8-inch kit on this 2022 Chevy Silverado 1500 four-wheel drive. Now this will fit the 2019 and up body style. For this installation, I'll be using common shop tools, including complete socket and wrench set up to 27 millimeters, 35 millimeter axle nut, breaker bar, and a torque wrench capable of 250 foot-pounds, 18 millimeter pass-through socket, a flathead screwdriver, a crescent wrench, fastener removal tool, electric and pneumatic impact drivers, C-clamps, 8 millimeter Allen wrench, T30 and T55 Torx bits, cutting and sanding tools, a pick tool, a drift punch, a dead blow mallet, a mini sledge, pry bars, and a tie rod end removal tool. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're up underneath the truck, right up at the front. This is our gravel guard. It's kind of underneath where our radiator is. We're going to follow that back and find this plastic skid plate. Now this skid plate needs to go away. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 13 millimeter and remove these 4 bolts. Once the skid plate's gone, we're going to put these 2 bolts back in and tighten them down to 20 foot-pounds. Okay, now these clip nuts are what the factory bolts go into, so we're going to make sure those get lined back up. All right, and we'll bring those to 20 foot-pounds. Okay, now I've already got this up on a lift. I've got it supported. You can use jack and jack stands. I've got the wheels and tires pulled off. Next, what I want to do is loosen up the upper strut bolts. We're going to use an 18 millimeter to do that. But before we can do that, we need to kind of push this bracket away. There's the rear strut bolt in the back actually has a harness that clips onto that upper strut nut. So we're going to pop that off of there. It's going to be very hard for you guys to see that, but this is what we're doing. Now we're just loosening these up. We're not taking them off at this time. All right, next we need to go ahead and take our tie rod loose. So what we're going to do is loosen up the tie rod with a 21 millimeter, and then we're going to go ahead and pop that loose before we take the nut all the way off. I'm going to use a tie rod puller. If you don't have a tie rod puller, you can also strike the boss on the side with a dead blow hammer to shake the taper loose. But we're going to go ahead and pull that loose right now. All right, now this is unseated. We're going to go ahead and pull it the rest of the way off and set it to the side. Okay, so you might run into this where our taper starts to spin, the taper bolt. So when we're trying to loosen that up, but the whole bolt is spinning. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a 10 millimeter on the taper bolt, and then hold that with the 21 millimeter. Now the 10 millimeter down here, I've got that set to tighten. That way, this one up here is loosening. All right, we can go ahead and pull that out, set that to the side. I like to put the factory hardware back on so that I know where it goes. All right, now we need to go ahead and take our ABS line and vehicle speed sensor loose from our knuckle and also our upper control arm. So I've got 4 bolts we're going to pull out. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to pull all those out with a 10 millimeter. All right, we're going to go ahead and pull the ABS line free from this bracket up here. And we're also going to pull our vehicle speed sensor out and set that off to the side, out of the way. Okay, and the brake line bracket also comes off with a 10 millimeter. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and remove our axle nut using a 35 millimeter axle nut socket. Once that's off, we're going to go ahead and tap on the end of our axle with a dead blow hammer to get it loose inside our hub. Now make sure as you're working with these CV axles, you're very careful not to damage them. They can be damaged fairly easily. So make sure you don't hyperextend that axle, and make sure you watch the boot as you're working with a CV. All right, now we're going to use an 18 millimeter to take out our two caliper bolts. Then we're going to take our brake caliper off and hang it out of the way. Just make sure you keep pressure off of our brake line. Okay, now that the caliper has been removed, we can go ahead and remove our rotor. Now what we need to do in order to do that is pull out the screw using a T30 Torx. Okay, next we need to disconnect the sway bar end link from the lower control arm using an 18 millimeter. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and loosen the upper control arm from our steering knuckle using an 18 millimeter, but we do not want to completely pull that off just yet. So this is a newer truck, so that might just pop loose by itself. If not, we're going to need to use a mallet to tap this loose to separate the taper. There we go. And it's lowering right down by itself, so we don't have to do anything else. If this was an older truck, or if this was just kind of stuck onto the taper, we would need to strike the boss with a dead blow mallet or use a ball joint separator to pry that down. Now we're going to use a 15 millimeter to remove the two lower strut bolts from the lower control arm. All right, now we're going to use a 24 millimeter and loosen up the nut that holds the steering knuckle to the lower control arm. We're not going to take it all the way off just yet, just loosen it up, and then if it does not separate by itself, we're going to strike right here with a dead blow hammer to unseat the taper. Okay, now we can go ahead and take off our 3 upper strut nuts. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and remove the knuckle from the truck. The way that we're going to do that is, first I've got the lower control arm supported with a floor jack. So that can't go down anymore. Next, what we'll be doing is pushing down on the upper control arm so we can go ahead and finish removing that 18 millimeter nut. All right, now that can go up. And now at the bottom, we're going to go ahead and take off the larger nut that holds the steering knuckle to the lower control arm. And next, what we can do is start to lower the floor jack. But while we're doing that, what we're going to do is start to pull the knuckle away from our CV axle while we push in on that CV axle. We're doing this in this order, in this fashion, so that we don't put unnecessary stress on the CV axle, and we're going to protect that boot. All right, now we can go ahead and remove the strut from the truck. Okay, now when you take out the factory hardware that holds in the upper control arm, that's a 21 millimeter on each side. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break them free first and then use a wrench and ratchet to pull them out the rest of the way. Okay, now all the steps we did on the passenger side, we've also done on the driver's side, so now we can go ahead and disconnect the sway bar and bring it down. We're using a 10 millimeter to do that. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and remove our lower control arms. I'm on the passenger side. We're going to do the exact same thing on the driver's side. We're going to need to use a 27 millimeter to take this off and hold it with a 27 on this side. We're going to maintain all that hardware. Now, as I pull this apart, we're going to lose the bind on here, and so this lower control arm is going to want to start to fall down. So keep that in mind. Make sure things are protected. All right, now when I loosen this side up, we're going to lose the rest of our bind, and this whole upper control arm is going to just kind of come straight up and down. Go ahead and remove all the factory hardware, including the cam gauges. Okay, before we lower the differential, what we need to do is we need to disconnect it from our drive line. So I've already got a mark on here lining everything up so that whenever we put it back together, we know where to set it because it is balanced from the factory. Next, what we want to do is pull out each one of these bolts. Now these come out with a 10 millimeter, but this also will swivel on you, and so you're not going to be able to just pull it out with a ratchet. So what I've got here, I've got a 10 millimeter socket with an extension or to go up to a 1/2 inch from 3/8, and then a swivel back behind it. I'm going to pull that out with a pneumatic impact. Now I can disconnect that and just let that hang out of the way. Okay, this is our differential, and right here is our steering. In between those two, we've got our shift actuator. This harness needs to be unplugged from the shift actuator, and there's a trick to it, so let me show you how that works. What we're going to do is just take a little flathead screwdriver. I'm going to push from this side. You can actually pull from this side over here too. But we need to get that red locking tab pulled forward. Then on the other end of that red locking tab, there's a tiny little black tab that we got to push in on, and then the plug will pull right out. Here's that tab. That tab needs to be pushed in so you can pull the plug out. Okay, so now that we've got this disconnected, we're going to go ahead and disconnect the harness from the differential. There's 3 places where fasteners need to be pulled off of the differential, and it's going to be kind of hard to see, but here you go. There we go, all free and clear. Okay, when we get up to the top of the differential, there's also a differential vent tube that needs to come off. You guys actually probably have a better view of that than I do. So we're just gonna pop that off. There we go. Okay, now we've got the differential supported with a couple of floor jacks. We're gonna go ahead and start removing the differential. There's 3 points where it's connected to the truck. Right here on the rear cross member, we're gonna go ahead and pull this bolt out. This is a 21 millimeter on each side. Okay, so now we can go ahead and take out our rear cross member. Now it's held in by 2 bolts on each side. So we got 2 on the driver's side and 2 on the passenger side. You're gonna use an 18 millimeter on each side of each one of these bolts. Go ahead and pull it out. Now go ahead and pull the 4 bolts out and lower the rear cross member. Okay, if we follow the differential over to the passenger side, we can find the differential passenger side hardware. So what we're going to use is an 18 millimeter on each side. We're going to take this nut off. We're going to leave the bolt in there for right now until we get the other side out so we can take everything down at the same time. There's a 21 millimeter on each side. Okay, now we're on the driver's side. This is the bolt that holds the differential in place on the driver's side. It goes right through the frame into the differential. Now we're going to use a T55 Torx bit. We're going to break it loose first, then pull it the rest of the way out. Okay, we're back on the passenger side where the differential bolt is that we started taking out. Now, not on every application, but on this particular truck, there's a heater valve that's in the way. In order to get this bolt out, we need to move that heater valve out of the way. So we've got a 10 millimeter head bolt right here that needs to come out. Then this whole heater valve will slide out of the way. Then we can bend this bracket down, pull the bolt out, and then put the heater valve back into place. All right, now we want to go ahead and carefully lower the differential to the ground. Okay, so here we are on the driver's side. This is where we just removed the rear cross member. Now, this is also where our lower control arm did rest. What we're going to do is we're going to cut this portion off. So I've measured in from here back 1 5/8 inch. I've already put a little line here. I put a line back here. We're going to cut all the way around and remove this piece. Now I'm going to go ahead and use a sanding wheel and clean all this up and touch it up with some black spray paint so it doesn't corrode. Okay, so here we are looking at the differential. You'll notice I've got some marks on here. What I want to point out is you've got some instructions that are going to tell you to go measure in from the pinion seal right here in 6 inches and make a mark on the top and the bottom fin, 6 inches in from that pinion seal. And then we're going to need to measure in about 3/8 of an inch from the edge and then just kind of make a mark all the way down and remove material that's going to give us some extra clearance. Now, I do want to point out, whenever I made my initial mark, I measured kind of from the bevel here up 3/8 of an inch. You really need to measure it from the edge here. If you take off a little bit more, it's not going to make a difference. The main thing is that this part of the housing that kind of bells out, we don't want to cut into that. And so what I did do is I made a little bit of a mark up on top showing where that is, so I don't want to cut into that there. But yeah, we're just going to remove this material right here and this material right there, and that will give us plenty of clearance. Even if we had about about an 1/8 inch less material we took out, we'd still have enough clearance to put that in. So I'm going to go ahead and use a cutting tool and pull all of that out. One other thing I want to point out before I start cutting here is that I do have some tape over top of the pinion seal, over top of the axle seal, over top of breather valve. I'm doing that just because I'm going to be throwing some aluminum shavings. I don't want any kind of aluminum shavings inside those seals. After I get done, I'll also blow it off with some high pressure air too, just to make sure that we don't have anything getting into our seals. All right, now I'm going to get a sanding wheel and clean it all up. Okay, here we are at our differential. I've got everything all cleaned up now from doing the trimming on the fins. This is the passenger side of the differential right here. And on this side right here, this is facing the front of the vehicle. This is where our actuator is. We're gonna look at this mount. Here is our differential drop bracket for the passenger side. Now you're gonna notice there's one that's the width of that and then one that's wider. Obviously we're using this one here. But we're also going to use a 3/16 spacer. It's just kind of nest right inside there. And then go ahead and get that lined up. Once that's lined up, we're going to take the 100mm bolt from our kit with your differential hardware. This is the second longest bolt. We're going to take a flat washer, run through there. We'll line all that up, push that through, and on the other side we're going to have a flat washer and a nut. Now this is a locking nut. What we're going to do is we're going to get that snug, but we're not going to tighten it down. We want to be able to still maneuver it a little bit. We're going to use 22mm wrench and ratchet to do that. All right, let's move on. Okay, here is our driver's side differential drop bracket, and this is our driver's side differential mount. What we're going to notice is that we've got a flat side and we've got an offset side. That offset side goes to the inside of the vehicle towards the center of the differential. What we're going to do is we're going to lower that down and get the holes lined up at the bottom. Then we're going to get out of our kit a 90mm bolt. That's one of the shorter bolts in our differential kit. We're going to run through one side and into the other. Put the nut on this side over here next to the differential. And we're going to tighten this down just snug as well, just so it sits in place, but we're not going to tighten it down all the way just yet. Also with a 22mm. So we're back underneath the passenger side of the truck. This is our passenger side factory differential mount location. What we're going to be doing is mounting the bracket to this point here. This is our heater valve that we had to move out of the way. We do not have to touch that anymore because we have new hardware that's not going to interrupt. But what we do need to do is take this sleeve and slide it into the larger hole. There's a smaller hole on this side, and so this crush sleeve just makes everything work with the new hardware. Okay, now I've got the factory differential back in place, supported on jack stands. I'm going to go ahead and start raising it up a little bit at a time to get the brackets lined up with the mounting points. We're going to do the passenger side first. We actually have some new hardware that we're going to use. This is the 110 millimeter bolt, which is the longest out of all the differential hardware. That's going to go through. We're going to use a washer on each side and a lock nut. And then we're also going to do a 90 millimeter on the driver's side once we get that one lined up. All right, now for the driver's side, we're going to start raising that up, get that lined up. And once we get it lined up, we're going to fasten that down using the factory bolt we took out of there to begin with. All right, now we're just putting that in place for right now. We'll come back later and torque it down to factory spec. Okay, now we're about to install the rear cross member. To get that in there, what I did is I went ahead and lifted up the differential to kind of clock it forward. I've got it supported on top of a floor jack. Now I'm going to go ahead and lift the cross member in place. Okay, so here's our rear cross member. You'll notice that we've got one hole on this side and two holes on this side to match the holes that are left from factory. So what I'm going to do is raise this up into place, and I'm going to go ahead and get it supported with a floor jack for right now. Okay, what I'm going to show you here, we're also going to repeat on the opposite side. This is the driver's side. So what you're going to notice is we've got an oval hole on your frame. That's for your cam alignment adjustment from factory. And here we've got just a round hole. What we're going to do to make sure this is positioned properly is we're going to use this cam block off plate. So you'll notice you've got a hole that's in here. I've already got the supplied bolt and washer going through. What we're going to do is we're going to line that up, get that in there, and then that keeps everything nice and aligned. So you got the pin going through the block off plate, and then the bolt will go through. And then what we're going to do is put another block off plate on the opposite side along with a washer and a nut. And we're going to get it cinched down but not tightened down all the way just yet. All right, now this is one of our factory cross member bolts for the factory cross member. We're going to use 3 of the 4 going back in. Obviously, we can't use a 4th one because it's no longer there. So we're going to do the 1 on this side and then the 2 on the driver's or the passenger side. And then we'll also use the factory hardware on the opposite side of the bolt to hold it into the new cross member. And do the same thing on the opposite side with the other 2. All right, so next what we're going to do is we're going to install our lower differential drop bracket to the cross member. Now we've got 4 holes in the cross member that are threaded and 4 holes in the bracket. What we're going to use is the provided 1/2-inch hardware using also a washer and a drop of thread locker. Now as we're lining that up, we're also going to need to push the differential to the side to get everything lined up. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, we're going to set those in place with 3/4. Okay, now I want to point out that I've got the differential supported with my floor jack here. What that did is that took the bind off of this. That way I could get these 2 bolts started. I've got those started. I'm going to go ahead and run them all in. All right, now we can go ahead and tighten down all 4 of these bolts to 95 foot-pounds. Okay, now we can go ahead and bolt our differential to our rear differential drop bracket. We're going to use the supplied hardware. This is the 90 millimeters. This is one of our shorter differential bolts, along with a washer on this side, along with a nut. We're going to get it connected, but we're not going to tighten it down at this time. Okay, next what we're going to do is reattach our differential tube to the differential. What we're going to want to do in order to do that is pull down on that line to get enough slack, and then we can just go ahead and slide it back on. And while we're right here, we're going to go ahead and reconnect our harness to this point here. And we're going to follow that down and reconnect down below. All right, following our harness down, we're going to go ahead and reconnect this fastener into this hole here, and then reconnect the plug into our actuator. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take the front cross member and lift it up into place. And I'm going to support it with a floor jack while I get everything lined up. Okay, just like on the rear cross member, the front cross member is going to attach with the same type of hardware. So we've got the bolt, we've got washer and cam block off plate. Now I will say the cam block off plates are a super tight tolerance. I did have to kind of tap that into place to where it would slide down the shaft of the bolt. But what we're going to do is go ahead and set that in. Make sure the cam block off plate is lined up. Go through the other side, and on the other side we'll have another cam block off plate. Washer and nut. We're only going to get this stuff connected right now. We're only not going to tighten it down. Now we're going to repeat the same process on the opposite side. All right, now we're going to go ahead and reinstall our factory lower control arm using the factory hardware, making sure it goes on the same orientation it came off. We're going to do that for both sides. All right, now we're going to go ahead and tighten our differential to our drop brackets in all 3 locations to 120 foot-pounds. All right, next what we're going to do is go ahead and tighten up our passenger side differential drop bracket to the frame using a 22 millimeter on each side. We're going to bring that to 120 foot-pounds. All right, we're going to go ahead and tighten down our rear cross member to 250 foot-pounds. We're going to do that on both sides. And then our 3 factory cross member bolts, we're going to tighten those to 90 foot-pounds. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and move up and tighten down the factory bolt with 120 foot-pounds using a T50. Okay, now using a 27 millimeter on both sides, we're going to tighten down our front cross member to 250 foot-pounds. Right, repeat that for the opposite side as well. All right, now if you notice the holes on the bottom of the cross members, that's for our new skid plate. So what we're going to do is we're going to set that skid plate up and line up those holes. I'm going to actually just set this in place and hold in position using a floor jack. Okay, so here are the 3 holes on the rear cross member and skid plate. We're going to go ahead and use bolt and washer, go up through the bottom, take a washer on top, along with a nut on top. We're going to get all of the hardware started in all 6 holes before we tighten any of them down. That's a locking nut, so that's as far as it's going to go. All right, now that we got all of our hardware lined up for the skid plate, we're going to go ahead and tighten it all down with a 17 millimeter on each side to 45 foot-pounds. Okay, now we need to go ahead and reattach our drive shaft. Now, I've already gone ahead and put some thread locker in each one of these threaded holes. So what we're going to do is lower the drive shaft down. Now, remember, we've got it marked where the original point was that we had it lined up to. So we're going to spin it until it lines back up. And then we're going to go ahead and start running these bolts through. And we're going to tighten them down to 35 foot-pounds. Make sure they're all lined up before you tighten down any of them. All right, now we're going to go ahead and bring them all to 35 foot-pounds. All right, now using the factory sway bar hardware, we're going to install the sway bar drop brackets and then torque down that hardware to 35 foot-pounds. And then once you do that, do the same thing on the driver's side. All right, once we bring these to 35 foot-pounds, we'll repeat the same process on the driver's side. All right, now on both sides, we're going to go ahead and line up the factory sway bar to our new sway bar drop bracket, and we're going to use the provided hardware. We've got a bolt with washer. We're going to have those come down through the bracket, and then we're going to set the sway bar up onto those bolts. Use a washer and lock nut. We're going to tighten all that down with a 17 millimeter on each side to 45 foot-pounds. All right, repeat the same on the opposite side. All right, now we're going to go ahead and take our new upper control arm and install it using the factory hardware. These are side specific. Make sure the stud that's attached to the factory or the new upper control arm is to the rear of the vehicle. So we're just going to line it up, slide it in over top, put the factory hardware back through. Now on each side, you're also provided some laser cut washers. Those are going to go on before the factory nut goes on. And once you've got it all in place, tighten down both sides to 90 foot-pounds. Well, this is where it's nice. These are pivot bushings inside the upper control arm, because once it's tightened down to 90 foot-pounds, there's no bind on it. We'll still be able to move the upper control arm up and down freely. That will give us the ability to keep the tools in there like the torque wrench. Okay, so here is the factory strut. I've already got this set up inside a strut compressor to compress this spring. We're going to need to put this spacer down at the bottom, sitting on top of the perch, and the spring is going to set on top of the spacer in that orientation. Now, speaking of orientation, it's also important to make sure that nothing shifts around during this process. So what I did is I went ahead and marked the top hat along with the isolator all the way along here, and then also where the perch is. Once this spring is off the perch, that perch can start to rotate. So I want to make sure that everything kind of lines up and stays in the correct orientation to the top of the strut. So now I'm going to go ahead and tighten this down and compress the strut. Okay. All right, now we need to go ahead and take the nut off the top of this strut. Now this has got a lock nut on there. It's a nylock nut, and it's going to want to cause the entire thing to spin. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use a pass-through socket so that I can also get a crescent wrench on top. The stud up at the top has a couple of flat spots, and so we're going to lock the crescent wrench onto the flat spots, and then we can start taking off the nut. Now that nut is only going to come up so far before it pushes the crescent wrench off, but that will give me enough space to be able to get a ratcheting wrench underneath it and finish taking it off with a ratcheting wrench. Okay, now just so you guys know, I'm pushing up on the bottom of that strut with a floor jack to raise this up in the hat. Now we're going to go ahead and get the ratcheting wrench on there. Okay, now what I'm going to do is go ahead and lower the strut out of the spring. And And when I do that, now the jounce is actually still up in there. If your jounce stays up in there, it's fine. You can just leave it. If it falls out, I want you to see what it looks like. This is basically what it looks like. So this is going to sit on top up here, but this needs to be off to the side while we do our operation here. So we're going to take the plastic cap off of the perch. Then we're going to take our new spacer and set it on top of the perch like so, and that will seat onto the perch. So it's going to be nice and tight on the perch. Next, what we can do is take our jounce and put it on the same orientation it came off. So the little plus right there goes to the bottom, flat goes to the top. And we're going to go ahead and feed it back up in and attach the nut and tighten it down up at the top. And again, I'm going to use the floor jack just to kind of hold it in place while we're doing all this. This is also a great time to make sure everything is lined up properly so that whenever you put the spring tension back on it, things won't be crooked. All right, that goes back on. And just the same way that it came off. All right, now we're going to go ahead and finish it off with a pass-through socket. Now make sure that's tightened down to 30 foot-pounds. All right, now that we've got everything lined up, the marks are exactly where they need to be, we're going to go ahead and decompress the strut and pull it out. Okay, now for this part of the install, what we're going to do is we're going to attach our lower strut to our lower strut extension. The way we're going to do that first off is taking these clip nuts out of our lower strut from the factory. So just take a flathead screwdriver and pop them off. All right, now you want to make sure you've got the orientation correct for your strut. And so this is the side of the strut that faces out of the vehicle. That puts this part of the strut facing towards the front of the vehicle. What we're going to do is now take our strut extension, because we have to make sure we have the correct strut extension, and we're going to attach it. So to identify the correct strut extension, the first thing you want to do is check to see if it's marked. Sometimes it'll be marked with a P or a D right down here. Sometimes though, if the powder coat is covering that up, you might not be able to distinguish just by looking at it for a mark. So I'm going to show you how to figure it out. Number one, these holes right here are only on this side, not on this side. So these holes need to be facing towards the front of the vehicle. Also, this offset right here needs to be facing out of the vehicle. And if you look at the angles here, this is a slightly different angle than this is right here. So those two angles need to point to the inside of the vehicle. Okay, just to recap, this part goes to the outside of the vehicle and this part goes to the outside of the vehicle. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate it like so. Let me take this clamshell portion off. This is going to slide into the hole here, and then the other side of the clamshell can go over top, and the bar pin is now trapped inside the hole. Next, what we're going to do is take some supplied hardware and put it in finger tight for right now. We got a bolt with a flat washer, and another bolt with a flat washer. Okay, for our bar pin from the top down, we're going to install the new hardware. Now in your kit, you're going to have bolts that have threads going all the way down to the head of the bolt. We're going to use that one along with a washer, go through the bar pin, and you might need to thread it through our clamshell half because there's a little bit of a bind before you get everything tightened up. And do that on both sides of the bar pin. All right, on the opposite side, we'll have another washer and a locking nut. And we'll do that on both sides of the bar pin. All right, now for all four of these, from the bottom through the top, we're going to use the bolt that does not have the threads going all the way down to the bolt head, along with a flat washer. And then from the top, we've got flat washer and locking nut. All right, now with hand tools, we're going to go ahead and get all this stuff snugged up, but we're not going to bring it all to final torque spec until everything is snugged up first. We're going to use 19mm tools up here and 17mm for all of this. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and take these to 45 foot-pounds. Then we can take the bar pins to 35 foot-pounds. Then once that's done, we can go ahead and do these four in a crisscross pattern also to 35 foot-pounds. All right, now that we've got everything torqued to proper spec, let's go ahead and show you. We've got a bar pin that's longer on one side than it is on the other. This is facing towards the rear of the vehicle. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take our thrust spacer, and that is going to slide over top of that bar pin, and make sure that the taper is facing away from the strut. Let's go ahead and set this into the truck. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and take our strut and put it back up into the frame cup, and we're gonna attach it with our factory hardware, but we're not gonna tighten it down just yet. Okay, now what we're gonna do is raise up our lower control arm and get our pin lined up to the lower control arm so we can attach it. Now I will mention to you that this still can be twisted to get lined up. Also, if your pin is not parallel to the mating surface on the lower control arm, you can take a big crescent wrench, tighten it down, and then rotate it back and forth to get it lined up properly. I've already got this one lined up, so we're gonna go ahead and set it in place. We've got new hardware. It's gonna go down through the top of the pin and down into the lower control arm. All right, now that I've got the first bolt started, I'm gonna go ahead and get that connected on the bottom, just so that I don't lose it. Okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and tighten down this hardware using a 17mm on each side to 50 foot-pounds. Then up top, the factory hardware to the strut goes to 35 foot-pounds with an 18mm. Okay, this is our factory steering knuckle. Now, the dust shield and the hub are gonna come loose from the factory steering knuckle and port over to our new steering knuckle. So we need to take that loose. We've got 4 bolts. We're gonna take those loose with an 18mm. We're not gonna pull those all the way out. Let me show you a trick. All right, now with these still threaded in, what we're gonna do is turn it up like so, take a dead blow hammer, and that dislodges our hub. Now we can go ahead and pull these the rest of the way out. All right, next with our steering knuckle, we've also got this O-ring that goes to the hub as well. That also needs support over, so we want to very carefully pull that out. I'm using a pick tool. You just want to make sure that you don't damage it coming out or going into the new unit. All right, now we can go ahead and install the factory O-ring into our new steering knuckle. All right, now we're going to take our hub and dust shield and we're going to attach it to our new steering knuckle using the factory hardware. Make sure it's nice and lined up before you drop it into place. And I like to line up all 4 of the bolts before I tighten any of them down. When we tighten them down, what we're going to do is we're going to tighten them down to 100 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and raise up the steering knuckle and mount it to the lower control arm, but before I do, I want to show you what's going to happen on the driver's side. This is the passenger side, but on the driver's side there is going to be something different, and since we're showing you the passenger side, I want to go ahead and show this to you now. So this is a spacer that is going to go on the driver's side CV axle. If you notice, you got a little bit of a bell right here where the axle comes in and bells up to the CV. You've also got a chamfered edge or a beveled edge on the inside of that spacer. So what you want to do is that spacer bevel needs to match up to where that bells out on the driver's side. So when you slide it in, it will go up against the axle and sit flush. But we're on the passenger side, so we're going to go ahead and attach without that spacer. We're going to attach to the lower control arm. As we're doing that, we're going to be feeding the axle into our spindle in our hub. Once you get the steering knuckle aligned to the lower control arm, use the factory hardware to attach to the bottom of the steering knuckle. And we're going to guide the CV axle into the hub as we line all this up. I'm going to go ahead and set the axle nut in place. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and tighten down the factory hardware on the lower control arm to 110 foot-pounds. Then we can tighten down our hub bolt to 160 foot-pounds. All right, now before I tighten down the lower control arm nut, what I'm going to do is attach our tie rod. That way it gives us something to torque against. Using a 24 millimeter, we're going to bring this to 110 foot-pounds. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and tighten this down. We're going to snug first with a pneumatic impact, and then we're going to tighten it down to 160 foot-pounds with our torque wrench. We're using the 35 millimeter axle nut. All right, now we can go ahead and attach the upper ball joint to our steering knuckle. We're going to tighten that down to 85 foot-pounds using an 18 millimeter. Now make sure that before you put this together, you have that bottom axle already tight, otherwise you run the risk of damaging the boot by pinching it. Okay, now this is a locking nut and the taper bolt will spin. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply pressure to the top of the upper control arm to seat that taper nut down into our steering knuckle so that we have plenty of friction so that we can turn this taper nut and lock it down. So what I'm going to do is take a pry bar, wrap some rag around it so that it doesn't mar any surfaces. And we're just going to push down. And with that pressure, we'll be able to tighten that down. All right, so we're going to go ahead and put the factory rotor back into place and reinstall it using the factory Torx bolt. And we're going to put this down to about 5 foot-pounds. Again, this is a T30 Torx bit that I'm using. Okay, now here's the factory caliper. I've gone ahead and applied a little bit of thread locker inside the threads on the caliper. What we're going to do is reinstall that, put on the factory bolts, and tighten that down to 100 foot-pounds. All right, we're using an 18 millimeter. I'm going to tighten it down here and then lock it down with a torque wrench. Okay, our ABS sensor needs to plug back into the new knuckle, but in order to do that, we've got a couple of fasteners up in this wheel well here that need to come out to give us some more room. So let's go ahead and pull those fasteners out. All right, we're going to route that around the brake line and go between our knuckle and our shock. Okay, now our ABS sensor is going to plug in right here to the steering knuckle, and we're going to use the factory hardware to secure it. We're going to tighten it down with a 10 millimeter. And immediately up ahead, we're going to have our ABS bracket. It's going to line up. We've got this peg right here is going to drop into this hole, and this hole is going to line up with our threaded hole. And we're going to use the factory hardware, put that in there, and tighten that down also with a 10 millimeter. All right, next what we're going to do, the ABS line is going to follow around here. We're going to take our factory bracket, and we've actually flipped it around. We're going to put it into this hole here. And once we get it kind of hand tight, we're going to set the line into the bracket so we can center it where it needs to be, and then tighten it down. And use the 10 millimeter for this too. Okay, now our factory brake line bracket needs to slide down the brake line so it can line up to these two holes right here. So this peg can drop down to this hole, and this hole can line up to the threaded hole here. But it's crimped down, so we need to uncrimp that. What I'm going to use is a flathead screwdriver and just kind of pry away at this so that it's loose enough to slide down. All right, now it is still a little bit snug, but I can rotate it, so let's go ahead and work it down. All right, next we're going to want to straighten this out a little bit to get that bend out of there so it can line up without kinking anything. All right, let's go ahead and use the factory hardware, get that lined up and tighten down. Okay, now we are going to go ahead and take our ABS line and wire tie it out of the way. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take a 21 millimeter and tighten down our tie rod end to 65 foot-pounds. All right, once we've completed everything on the driver's side as well, then we can go ahead and reconnect the factory sway bar to the lower control arm at the end link. We're going to use the factory hardware. We're just going to connect it. We're not going to tighten it down until all the way of the vehicle is resting on the suspension with the wheels and tires on. All right, now as you're lowering this down, keep in mind that when you push this down, it's also pushing down on the driver's side. So make sure that one's lined up to where it's going to drop down into the lower control arm. And repeat the same on the opposite side. Okay, so we're at the rear of the vehicle now. We're on the driver's side as well. So this is the driver's side rear shock. This is our frame rail, our bump stop. What I want to focus on first is this brake line assembly right here. We've got a bracket that's attached to the inside of the frame rail. What we're going to do is we're going to remove both of those bolts with a 13 millimeter and retain those bolts. Okay, now what we are looking at is the top of a differential. If you notice, we've got an ABS harness that's coming down here. It goes to a module right here. What we want to do is take out these two bolts that hold this in place. Then we're also going to take loose this bracket from the fastener here. And then also right here, we're going to take those loose. We use a 10mm for the bolts up top. Now we're going to use a fastener removal tool to pull these fasteners off of the bracket. Okay, now I've got the truck a little closer to the ground. I've got the differential supported with a floor jack. Next, what we need to do is on both sides, go ahead and remove both the rear shocks. It's a 21mm. You're going to need a ratchet and a wrench. All right, so we are on the passenger side. This is the lower passenger side shock. What we're going to do is go ahead and pull this bolt out using a 21mm on each side. Now be careful because there may be some weight and some tension on this bottom shock. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and pull the bolt out. Now, in order to get this bolt free, I did go ahead and push up on the floor jack a little bit to raise the axle just to take the bind off of the shock at the bottom. Let's go ahead and go up to the top and take the top bolt out using a 21mm. All right, here's our passenger side rear shock up at the top. We're going to go ahead and pull out that bolt. All right, repeat the same for the shock on the driver's side. All right, so we're over here on the passenger side. The process I'm about to show you, we've already done on the driver's side. What you want to do though is if you do the driver's side first, make sure you loosen up the U-bolts on the passenger side just to take the bind off of it so everything can move freely. Since everything is done on the driver's side, now let me go ahead and show you what to do here. What we're going to do first is take off the 4 nuts for the U-bolts. I've still got the axle supported with a floor jack, so I'm going to take these 4 off and take off the U-bolts. All right, we're going to use a 21mm. All right, now make sure you set this to the side because we will be reusing it. All right, let's go ahead and take out our U-bolts. Okay, now this is our lift block. Now I'm only showing this to you for size relation. What we're going to do is we're going to lower the axle using our floor jack. And then what we want to do is we want to lower it enough to where this lift block will be able to fit in between our spring pack and our axle. That way we can clamp down our spring pack and take it apart. All right, now as you're lowering that axle, make sure you keep a good eye on your ABS lines and your brake lines. Make sure you're not stressing anything. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and attach some clamps. We got a couple of C-clamps we're going to put on either side of our pin. What this is going to do is it's going to take the spring tension off of the pin so we can remove that. We just want to get it nice and snug. You don't need to get it super tight. All right, now we're going to go ahead and pull this nut off using a 15mm. Now keep in mind, this is a leaf spring. It is a spring. It does have a lot of tension on it. Make sure you're being safe with this. All right, now we need to go ahead and remove the center pin from the leaf pack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap that out using a dead blow. All right, now I'm going to use a punch to get this out the rest of the way. And discard that factory pin. All right, now we can very carefully release the tension off of our spring pack by slowly releasing the pressure off of our C-clamps, a little bit of time on each side. All right, now this is our overload spring. We can go ahead and pull that off. We'll just kind of work it back and forth until it drops out. And now we're going to go ahead and knock this pin out using a punch. I'm just going to use my 21 millimeter deep well here. Okay, now before we go any further, I want to give you guys a really quick note. This is the new center pin that's going to go up through our leaf pack and support all that and keep it all held together. At the bottom, we've got this portion that's going to be a guide that goes into the top of our lift block. Now, if you look at the lift block, we've got a hole in the top of the lift block. That center pin, when everything glues together, that center pin is going to drop down into that hole on the lift block, and it's got to line up. One thing that we did notice is whenever we fit everything together, there wasn't quite enough room. It might have just been extra powder coat that was in here. We did have to kind of drill that out with a step bit and then repaint it just to make sure that everything was fine. And then we had clearance for that center pin. So make sure you check that before you put everything together. Now let's go ahead and reassemble our spring pack. Okay, so here is our overload support. Now, one thing I wanted you guys to keep an eye on is you've got a lot of different things to make sure stay in place. So you've got a bunch of shims in between your springs. Make sure they stay lined up. Here is our new guide pin that's going to go up through the overload. Now I'm just going to set that down here for right now. And here is our new addle leaf. Now you may notice some color on the ends. That is where I've applied some anti-seize. That's going to help this to keep from squeaking during operation. So what we're going to do, the hole in that addle leaf is going to line right up to our center pin. And now we're going to take this and lift it up and line it up to the holes in our leaf pack. So we got two leaves that are here. It's going to go through both of those holes. Now, keep in mind also that this leaf does float back and forth, so you're going to want to keep that all lined up. As you're lining it up, it does want to move around a little bit, especially once we put the clamps on there. So it's a little bit of a balancing act, but just work with it and you'll get through it. Okay, now I've got the spring compressed to where the pin is coming up about a 1/2 inch protruding up from the top. Now, if you've got part of the pin that's pushing down and it's kind of creating a little bit of a bind and the pin won't go up a little further, you can always take a 4 millimeter Allen wrench to the bottom of the pin and turn the pin, the threads at the top where it's catching the bind will draw it up to the top. Now I'm going to go ahead and put our plate where our U-bolts ride right up on top and set the nut in place. Now I'm going to use a 17 millimeter up at the top and a 4 millimeter Allen wrench at the bottom and start tightening this pack down. Make sure that everything is lined up, that you don't have anything crooked, and then let's go ahead and tighten that down. We'll be tightening this down to 55 foot-pounds. Now, as I tighten this, it's going to take some of the spring tension and put it inside the pack, and so these are going to loosen up and I'll be pulling them off. All right, now we're going to go ahead and torque this down to 55 foot-pounds. Once I get it to 55 foot-pounds, I'm going to go ahead and put the C-clamps back on either side and then tighten it again to 55 foot-pounds. That way, I'm tightening it down with the spring tension off of it. All right, now we're going to go ahead and take our lift block and set it in place. Remember, this pin needs to line up to the hole in the perch, and this hole up here needs to line up to our center pin in our spring pack. All right, and very slowly use the floor jack to raise it up. All right, keep going. All right, that's good. All right, now we're going to go ahead and set our new U-bolts into place and line them up with the factory U-bolt bracket down at the bottom. All right, now our new U-bolt hardware, you're going to have a washer and a nut for each one of these studs coming out for the U-bolts. Now, on one side of the nut, you're going to notice it's got a little bit of a taper. That is the lock side, so you want to start on the opposite side onto the threads. Set it in place, and then you'll feel it start to lock up. Go ahead and go to the next one. We're not going to tighten these down all the way just yet, but we are going to get them connected and set up at the top to draw a little bit of pressure down. We're not going to tighten it down all the way until the way the vehicle is on the ground. All right, now let's go ahead and put it up to the top using a 22 millimeter. All right, repeat the entire process for the driver's side. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and install our Bilstein extended length Falcon shocks. Now, if you've got the Falcon shocks, it's going to be body side up. If you've got the Bilstein shocks, it'll be body side down. We're just going to attach it with the factory hardware. We're not going to torque it down all the way at this time. We're going to wait until the weight of the vehicle is on the ground before we do that. But we can get it in place and get it snug with a 21 millimeter. Okay, next what we're going to do is attach the bottom to the bottom shock mount using the factory hardware. Again, we are not going to bring it to final torque spec. We're just going to snug it up on each side with a 21 millimeter. And repeat the same for the driver's side. All right, now we're back up on top of our differential. This is our main brake line bracket on the differential. This is right here is where we took our ABS module away from the brake line bracket. What we're going to do is we're going to put an ABS extension bracket up on top of that. Using the factory hardware, we're going to go ahead and tighten that down. Now I'll take a 10 millimeter. All right, next we're going to go ahead and line up our ABS module to our bracket. That's going to go together with provided hardware. We've got a bolt with washer it's going to go through, and then washer and lock nut on the other opposite side. And then we're going to tighten that down with a 10 millimeter on each side. All right, now we can go ahead and reinstall our plastic fasteners into the bracket. Okay, now we are on the driver's side. This is the brake line bracket we took loose. This is our factory hardware we took out of it. Here is our new brake line drop bracket. Now, you'll notice that we've got a little bit of an angle here and a little bit of an angle here. This is a sharper angle up here than it is down here. This is closer to 90 degrees. This goes to the bottom, and also you want it to angle back up towards the front of the vehicle. So that's how you get the orientation correct. What I'm going to do is get the factory hardware in there and tighten it down with a 13 millimeter. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and attach our brake line drop bracket to our factory brake line bracket using supplied hardware. We've got a bolt with flat washer. It's going to go through to a flat washer and lock nut on the opposite side. We're going to tighten all that down with a 13 millimeter. Okay, now we've got everything put together. We're gonna go ahead and put the wheels and tires back on the truck, drop it back to the ground, then we can get right there and put everything to the proper torque spec. Okay, now with the tires on the truck, go ahead and lower it to the ground. With all the weight of the vehicle on the suspension, we can go ahead and tighten down the upper control arms to 110 foot-pounds, the sway bar end length to 45 foot-pounds, and the lower control arms, we're gonna set those to 150 foot-pounds, putting the cams in the center of their slots so that the alignment shop can do the final settings and set the final torque setting. Now for the rear, we're gonna go ahead and evenly tighten all the U-bolts until we get them to 110 foot-pounds. Then the shock hardware goes to 65. Next, we take it to the alignment shop to get aligned. Once we get it back, after 500 miles, we're gonna go ahead and do a retighten of all the hardware. Well, that concludes the installation. If you have any questions, call the experts or visit us online.